The doorbell rang, cutting through the silence like a sharp knife. Inside the small, dimly lit house, the sound of muffled sobs echoed from somewhere deeper within. At the doorstep stood a delivery guy, holding a package in his hands, oblivious to the storm raging inside. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had no idea what kind of danger awaited him the moment he stepped up to the door. A simple delivery, that's all he thought he was doing. He rang the bell again, this time a little louder. He could hear movement inside. The door opened just slightly, revealing a woman whose face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She looked like she hadn't seen the sun in days. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes torn. There was something in the way she hesitated before answering the door that sent an icy chill down his spine. "Delivery for?" he asked, holding the package out. The woman opened the door just a crack, barely wide enough for the package to fit through. She glanced over her shoulder nervously, as if expecting someone to burst through the door at any moment. "Is everything all right?" the delivery guy asked, his voice laced with concern. He had delivered to this address before, but never with this sense of unease in the air. She flinched as though his question had struck a nerve. Without speaking, she took the package from him, but her hand trembled. The door closed even more swiftly, but not before the delivery guy caught a glimpse of what lay beyond. A man stood behind her, his face twisted with anger, his voice barely audible but filled with menace. "Go inside, now," the man growled. Something inside the delivery guy snapped. His instincts kicked in, and before he knew it, his body was already moving. "Hey," he called out, stepping forward. "Is everything okay in there?" The man at the door turned quickly, his eyes flashing with fury. "Mind your business," he barked, stepping out onto the porch. "Get lost." But the delivery guy, now sensing something far more sinister than an ordinary domestic dispute, couldn't walk away. He was just a delivery guy, but something inside him couldn't ignore what he had witnessed. The woman was still standing behind the door, her eyes pleading for help. In that moment, everything in his life seemed to freeze. No one should have to live like that. No one should have to suffer in silence. He looked back at the angry man, who was now glaring at him. "This is none of your business," the man spat. But it wasn't just that anymore. The delivery guy, still holding the package, stepped forward, his body now in front of the woman's door. "It is now," he said, his voice more forceful than he intended. He didn't know where this courage was coming from, but it felt like the right thing to do. Without a second thought, he shoved the door open and stepped inside. The woman gasped, but she didn't stop him. She didn't need to. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The man lunged at him, furious. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The man lunged at him, furious. The delivery guy didn't flinch. He was already too far in to back out now. He positioned himself between the woman and her husband, the tension thickening in the air. "You need to leave," he said, his voice firm but calm, every inch of him ready for what might come next. The husband took a step back, his face contorting with rage, but the delivery guy stood his ground, silently challenging the man to come closer. What happened next changed everything. The woman rushed past them, silently slipping away into the back of the house, and for the briefest moment, the delivery guy thought he had done enough. But then the sound of something heavy crashing to the floor snapped him back to reality. He looked around, his pulse racing. The door slammed shut, and suddenly, he was alone with the husband. "Now you've done it," the man sneered. "You think you can just waltz in here and take control of my house?" The delivery guy swallowed hard, his breath shallow, but his feet stayed rooted in place. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew this moment, this decision, would alter the course of his life forever. The woman's terrified gaze flashed in his mind. He had to help her. He couldn't walk away now. There was no turning back. With a final glance toward the door she had slipped through, the delivery guy steeled himself for whatever was about to happen next. And just like that, he was no longer just a delivery guy. The delivery guy stood frozen, eyes locked on the enraged man in front of him. The tension in the room felt like it could snap at any moment. The door slammed shut, sealing them inside together, and for a brief moment, all the noise from the outside world seemed to disappear. It was just him and this angry figure who seemed ready to explode at any second. "Leave now, before I make you," the man growled, stepping closer, his fists clenched at his sides. The delivery guy held his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. "Not until she's safe," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through him. He wasn't sure what was driving him, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't walk away from this. He had already made up his mind. The man let out a low laugh, a cold, humorless sound. "You think you can stop me? I'll make sure you regret this." The delivery guy didn't flinch. He didn't know how far things would go, but in that moment, he was certain about one thing: he was going to protect her. Just then, he heard the soft patter of footsteps behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know it was the woman. She had somehow slipped past the man and was now standing in the doorway, her face pale but determined. The delivery guy glanced at her. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was a flicker of something else, something like hope. In that moment, he understood. She wasn't just asking for help, she was ready to take a chance, to fight for her freedom. She needed him, but it was clear she was also ready to fight her own battles. They weren't just two strangers in a dangerous situation anymore, they were two people facing a terrifying reality together. "I need to go," she whispered, voice trembling, but her eyes remained locked on his. "Please, we have to leave now." Without waiting for a response, she stepped toward the door. But before she could even take a step, the man lunged at her, grabbing her by the arm with enough force to make her gasp in pain. "No!" the delivery guy shouted, rushing forward before he even realized what he was doing. He grabbed the man's arm, yanking it away from the woman with a strength he didn't know he had. The woman stumbled back, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She looked at the delivery guy with a mixture of gratitude and fear. She could see the determination in his eyes: he wasn't going to let her go. "Don't touch her," the delivery guy warned, his voice low and steady. The man glared at him, eyes burning with fury. The room fell into a tense silence. The woman looked between them, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Please," she begged, her voice weak. "I'm sorry you're involved in this. But I don't want you to get hurt." The delivery guy shook his head. "It's too late for that. I'm already in this. And so are you." For the first time, the woman's expression softened, and a tear escaped from her eye. "I don't know what to do. He's always been like this. I don't know if I can leave him. I'm scared." The delivery guy paused, his heart aching at the raw vulnerability in her voice. He had expected anger, maybe even resistance. But he hadn't expected this: her fear, her struggle with the very idea of escape. "I understand," he said softly, taking a step closer. "I can't imagine what you've been through. But you don't deserve this. You deserve more." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, there was a quiet understanding between them, something unspoken but deeply felt. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a person with a story, with dreams, with fears. And the delivery guy could see that now, more clearly than ever. "We need to leave," the woman said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. The delivery guy nodded, looking back at the door that led to the outside world. He knew they didn't have much time. The man would come after them soon enough. But for now, they had a moment, a brief window to escape. "Do you have a place to go?" he asked, his eyes never leaving hers. She nodded. I think so." Without another word, they moved toward the back door. The delivery guy glanced over his shoulder, making sure the man wasn't following them. He was still seething, but he hadn't moved. As they made their way through the house, the woman spoke again. "Thank you," she said quietly, almost like she didn't believe what she was saying. "I don't know what I would have done without you." The delivery guy looked at her, his heart heavy with emotions he didn't fully understand. He had only just met her, but in that moment, it felt like they had been through something far deeper than a simple delivery. She wasn't just a woman in need, she was someone who had endured too much, who had been pushed to the edge. And yet, here she was, still standing, still fighting for her life. "No one deserves to be treated like that," he replied, his voice firm. "No one." The words hung in the air between them as they reached the back door. But as the woman stepped into the cool night air, the delivery guy couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. The night was far from over, and the danger was far from gone. And yet, something about this moment, this unexpected connection, felt like the first real choice he had made in his life. And it was only just beginning. The night air felt sharp against their skin as the woman and the delivery guy hurried away from the house. Their footsteps were soft, almost silent, but the tension between them was anything but quiet. The woman moved quickly, her steps hesitant but determined, as though she was finally making a decision she had put off for far too long. The delivery guy kept his pace steady beside her, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds, unsure if they were being followed. The silence was heavy, and the weight of the woman's past hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. "I don't know how to thank you," she said after a moment, her voice soft, still full of disbelief. "I don't even know your name." The delivery guy offered a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. He wasn't sure how to respond. He wasn't doing this for recognition or a name. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. "I don't need thanks," he said quietly, glancing down at the woman as they walked. "But, you can tell me where we're going. I'll get you there." She hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting around, searching for any sign of danger. Then, her voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "I have a friend, not far from here. She'll help me." The delivery guy nodded, though his mind was racing. He wasn't entirely sure they could trust anyone right now, not with the way things were escalating. He kept his focus on the woman's words, watching the fear in her eyes as they walked. Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a shadow creeping around the corner of the street ahead. His heart skipped a beat. Without thinking, he instinctively grabbed the woman's arm and pulled her into the shadow of a nearby alleyway. The woman gasped, panic rising in her chest as she looked up at him. "What's happening? Are they?" The delivery guy held his finger to his lips, signaling for her to stay quiet. His eyes darted to the figure approaching from the shadows. He could see it was the husband, his anger unmistakable as he stalked down the street, his movements erratic and fast. "He's looking for us," the delivery guy muttered, his pulse quickening. "We need to stay hidden." The woman's breath hitched as she clutched her arms around herself. "He won't stop. He never stops looking." The delivery guy didn't know how much more of this the woman could take. She had been living in fear for far too long, and now, with every step they took, it seemed like the weight of her past was pulling her back. But he couldn't think about that now. He had made a promise to protect her, and he wasn't about to back down. He just had to get them out of here, away from the man who had tormented her for so long. "We'll figure this out," he said, though the uncertainty in his voice made it clear he didn't have all the answers. "But we need to move now." The man was getting closer, his voice rising in anger. "Where are you, you coward?" The delivery guy grabbed the woman's hand and started pulling her farther into the alley, his mind racing for a plan. He had to get her out of sight, away from the path the husband was on. Suddenly, the woman stopped in her tracks, looking at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "I can't keep running," she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so scared. I don't know how much longer I can do this. The delivery guy's heart ached for her. He had no idea what kind of pain she had been through, what kind of life she had left behind, but in that moment, he realized just how much fear she was carrying. She was standing on the edge, ready to break, and he wasn't sure what would happen if she did. You don't have to do it alone, he said quietly, squeezing her hand. I'll help you, no matter what. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she nodded. She didn't say anything else, but the way she looked at him, grateful, yet still terrified, spoke volumes. But their moment of solace didn't last long. The husband's voice, now closer, snapped them both back into reality. I know you're out there, the man shouted, his voice filled with venom. You can't hide forever. The delivery guy turned to the woman, his eyes narrowing in determination. We need to go. Now. They ran, their footsteps echoing in the quiet night as they dashed down the alley. The husband was close now, too close, but they just needed a few more minutes, a few more seconds to escape. As they rounded the corner and reached the end of the alley, the delivery guy pulled her toward a parked car. Without thinking, he yanked open the door and shoved her inside. I'll drive, he said, slamming the door shut and jumping into the driver's seat. He could hear the footsteps of the husband getting closer, the angry shouts growing louder. But they were faster. They were out of there, speeding down the road, leaving the chaos behind them. For the briefest moment, the delivery guy allowed himself to breathe, glancing over at the woman who was now sitting beside him. Her hands were shaking, but she was safe, at least for now. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The husband wasn't going to let this go. And neither would the woman's past. The delivery guy glanced at her, his voice low but steady. Where to? She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and gratitude. Anywhere but here. And with that, the journey to escape truly began. The car sped down the empty streets, its tires humming against the pavement, cutting through the cold night air. The delivery guy's knuckles were white as he gripped the wheel, his eyes darting constantly from the rearview mirror to the road ahead. He could feel the woman's presence beside him, her breath shallow, her eyes scanning the darkened streets as if expecting to see the husband's car appear in the distance at any moment. Every few seconds, she would glance at him, her face a mix of fear and exhaustion. It was clear she hadn't slept in days, and the weight of her past was settling heavily on her shoulders, even now, as she sat next to the one person who was trying to help her. I'm sorry, she whispered after a while, her voice breaking the heavy silence in the car. I didn't mean to drag you into this. The delivery guy shook his head, not taking his eyes off the road. You didn't drag me into anything, he said, his voice steady, though the adrenaline from the chase was still pumping through his veins. I'm here because I want to be. She looked at him again, this time with a hint of surprise. You really don't have to do this, she said softly. I know I've already put you in danger. Like I said, he replied, his jaw tightening, you're not in this alone. I won't leave you behind. There was a pause, then she sighed, as if the weight of her burden was starting to crack her resolve. I just don't know how much longer I can run. Every time I think I'm safe, he finds me. It's like, he's always right behind me. The delivery guy understood her fear. He could see it in her eyes, the kind of fear that wouldn't go away just because they drove a few miles away from the house. The woman's past, her years of torment, weren't things that could be left behind with just a few turns of the car's wheel. We'll figure it out, he said, his voice more confident than he felt. But we need to keep moving. We can't stop just yet. She nodded, but it was clear she wasn't convinced. I don't know if I can keep running. I'm tired. I'm so tired. Her words struck a chord deep inside him. He couldn't imagine what she had gone through, but he could feel the weight of her exhaustion, the years of being trapped in an endless cycle of fear and regret. You don't have to do it forever, he said, trying to offer some comfort. "We'll find a place where you can rest. A safe place." "I don't have anywhere," she replied quietly. "I have nothing left." The words hit him harder than he expected. She had nothing but fear, nothing but the hope that maybe, just maybe, this man who had come to her rescue would be able to help her start over. He didn't have all the answers, and he couldn't promise her that everything would be okay. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose that was stronger than anything he had ever felt before. He couldn't promise to make everything perfect, but he could give her one thing: safety. "I'll help you get somewhere safe," he said again, more firmly this time. "You don't have to go through this alone." The woman's eyes welled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. She looked out the window, watching the world blur by as they continued to drive, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. Minutes passed like hours, and soon, the cityscape began to fade into the distance. The lights of the city were replaced by dark, quiet roads that led out of town, into the unknown. He wasn't sure where they were heading yet, but he knew they couldn't go back. There was no turning around. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spotted an old motel sign in the distance. The faded neon lights flickered weakly, but it was enough. A place where they could rest, regroup, and figure out their next move. He pulled the car into the parking lot and killed the engine. The woman didn't move at first, still staring at the motel with a blank expression. He could tell she was debating whether it was worth it, whether they could trust the place, whether it would be safe. But after a long moment, she turned to him and nodded. "Let's go inside," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The delivery guy got out of the car, walking around to her side and opening the door. She hesitated for a second, but he offered his hand to help her out, and she took it, her fingers cold and trembling in his grasp. Together, they walked into the motel lobby, a place that seemed like a far cry from the danger they had just escaped. But for now, it was all they had. The motel clerk barely looked up as they approached, his eyes glued to the screen of his television. The delivery guy didn't say much. He just paid for a room, handed the key to the woman, and they walked toward the door without another word. Inside the room, the door clicked shut behind them, and the delivery guy let out a long, exhausted sigh. The woman collapsed onto the bed, her body sagging with relief. The silence between them was comfortable now, but it was filled with unspoken questions and the weight of the journey ahead. The delivery guy sat on the edge of the bed, trying to think of something to say, but the truth was, there wasn't much left to say. They had come a long way, but the road ahead was still long, and the danger wasn't over yet. But for now, they were safe. And that was enough. As he looked at the woman, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. She might have started this journey with nothing, but now, she had someone who would fight for her, who would make sure she didn't have to face her fears alone. And that, he realized, was something worth fighting for. The quiet room seemed to press in around them, thick with unspoken words. The woman lay on the bed, her eyes closed as if she could escape the weight of everything by shutting them out. The delivery guy sat at the small, cracked table near the window, his mind racing. What was the next move? Where could they go from here? The truth was, he had no clear answers. He had never been in a situation like this before. He was just a delivery guy, someone who showed up, handed off packages, and moved on. But now, he was in the middle of something much bigger. A life-or-death situation that could change everything. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. He looked out the window, watching the cars pass by on the distant highway. The woman had fallen asleep, or perhaps she was just pretending to. Her body, still tense with the fear of what might happen next, told him she wasn't truly at ease. And he couldn't blame her. They had made it this far, but the husband wasn't the type to give up. He was relentless, and the delivery guy knew that by now. He knew the man would come for them, he had to. The rage in his eyes, the promises of violence, they weren't empty words. The husband would come, and he would stop at nothing to find her. But the delivery guy wasn't willing to give up either. Suddenly, the woman stirred on the bed, her hand gripping the sheets as if trying to ground herself. She sat up slowly, her gaze meeting his. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice raw. "I didn't mean to drag you into all of this. I never meant to get anyone else involved." The delivery guy shook his head, pushing away the knot that had formed in his chest. "You didn't ask for this, but that doesn't matter now," he said firmly. "You're not alone. We'll figure this out. Together." She looked at him for a long moment, as if considering his words carefully. Her eyes softened, but a shadow of doubt still lingered in her gaze. She didn't seem to fully believe what he was saying. Maybe it was because she had been let down too many times before. Maybe it was because she was used to being disappointed. But he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. "I don't know what to do," she confessed quietly, her voice breaking. "I feel like I'm running from my own life. I've spent so long in that house, in that prison. I don't even know who I am anymore." Her words struck him harder than he expected. He could see it in her eyes, the loss, the struggle to find a way out of a past that had almost swallowed her whole. She wasn't just running from the abusive husband. She was running from everything that had kept her trapped for so long, the fear, the memories, the broken pieces of herself. The delivery guy took a deep breath, his heart heavy with empathy for the woman. He wasn't a therapist, and he wasn't someone who could fix everything. But he was the one standing beside her now, and that meant something. It had to mean something. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," he said gently. "You don't have to know everything. Just take it one step at a time. We'll figure it out as we go." She nodded, though there was still a look of uncertainty in her eyes. "I don't even know where to go," she whispered, the weight of the unknown pressing on her shoulders. "I have no family. No friends." He made sure of that. "I don't know if anyone would even care if I disappeared." The word stung, and the delivery guy felt a deep ache for her. No one should feel that way, not after everything she had been through. But the reality was harsh, and he couldn't deny the truth in her words. "Hey, don't say that," he said, his voice firm. "You matter. You have a right to be free, and we'll find a way to make that happen. I don't care what it takes." She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and something else, something like hope. It was so fragile, so tentative, but it was there. The spark of something that hadn't been completely extinguished. But just as the silence began to settle between them again, something caught his eye, a flash of movement outside the window. His heart skipped a beat. It was him. The husband. He was here. The delivery guy's blood ran cold. The man was standing across the parking lot, his eyes scanning the motel, his face twisted in anger. It was clear that he wasn't leaving until he found them. He had tracked them down, and now there was no turning back. The woman turned to look, her face draining of color. "No. He found us," she whispered, her voice shaking. The delivery guy quickly stood up, his mind racing. They needed to act fast, but there was no easy escape now. They were trapped in the middle of nowhere, and the only way out was through the front door. "Stay down," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. He grabbed the woman's arm gently, guiding her toward the back of the room. There was a small door leading to a fire escape, a narrow way out that would give them a chance to slip past the man. The woman nodded, her fear evident in every movement. But she didn't argue. She was ready to fight, ready to run. And that gave him hope. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled as they reached the fire escape. The husband's shouts echoed louder now, and they both knew the time to act was now or never. The delivery guy took one last look at the motel room, then at the woman, and with a steady hand, he opened the door. "We're going to make it," he said, his voice more for himself than her. Together, they stepped into the darkness, not knowing what was waiting for them on the other side, but knowing they couldn't stop running now. And maybe, just maybe, they would finally find the safety they were both searching for. The night air hit them as they stepped onto the fire escape, the cold pressing against their skin. The woman, her breath quick and shallow, clung to the delivery guy as he guided her down the narrow metal stairs, each step echoing loudly in the stillness of the night. Every second felt like an eternity, each one stretching out with the knowledge that the man who had tormented her for years was only a few steps behind. They reached the ground, and the delivery guy glanced around quickly, scanning the parking lot for any sign of the husband. His heart was pounding in his chest, but there was no time to waste. They had to move fast. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline. He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the back of the motel, where a narrow alleyway led into the shadows. The world around them was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that made everything feel fragile. The woman didn't say anything. She just followed him, her steps fast and shaky, her eyes darting nervously over her shoulder. "He won't stop looking for me," she said suddenly, her voice a whisper of fear. "I don't know how much longer I can keep running." The delivery guy didn't respond at first. He didn't know how much longer they could keep running either. But as he turned the corner and saw the dim streetlights ahead, he knew they couldn't afford to think too far ahead. They just needed to keep moving, one step at a time. But then, something changed. As they reached the end of the alley, the woman stopped in her tracks, her hand slipping from his. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tense with worry. She turned to face him, her eyes wide and filled with something he couldn't quite place. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can keep running. Every time I get close to something, to safety, it slips away." He stepped closer to her, his hand resting on her shoulder. He could see the fear in her eyes, the fear of the unknown, the fear of never being able to escape the cycle of pain and abuse. "You don't have to do it alone," he said softly. "I'll help you. I'll make sure you're safe." But her gaze dropped to the ground, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not just him, you know. It's me, too. I've been so lost for so long, I don't even know who I am anymore." His heart ached for her. She wasn't just running from the abusive man. She was running from herself, running from a life that had torn her apart. She had spent so many years trying to survive that she had forgotten how to live. And now, after everything, she didn't know how to put the pieces back together. "You're not lost," he said gently, lifting her chin so she would look at him. "You're here, and that's what matters. We'll figure this out. One step at a time. You don't have to have it all figured out right now." For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, slowly, she nodded. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe in the possibility of something better. Before they could move, they heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. The delivery guy's heart dropped into his stomach. The husband had found them. "Go," he said urgently, pushing the woman toward the side of a nearby building. He moved quickly, slipping into the shadows with her. They both crouched low, their breaths coming in quick bursts as they tried to remain as quiet as possible. The footsteps grew louder. The husband was close. Too close. From behind the building, the delivery guy could just make out the outline of the man as he stalked past, his shadow stretching long in the dim light. His eyes were wild, searching for any sign of his wife. The delivery guy held his breath, willing the man to keep walking, to go past them. Every second felt like an eternity. The woman beside him was trembling, and he could feel her fear pulsing in the air between them. But they stayed silent, unmoving, as the husband's footsteps finally faded into the distance. The delivery guy waited a few more seconds before he dared to speak. "Is he gone?" the woman whispered, her voice shaking. He peeked around the corner, his heart still racing. The street was empty now. The man had gone. For now, at least. "He's gone," the delivery guy said, though the words tasted like a lie. He knew that the moment they stopped moving, the moment they relaxed, it would start all over again. The fear, the chase. There would be no peace. Not until they found a way to end this. He turned to her. "We need to move quickly. We can't stay here." She nodded, still visibly shaken. He could see the weight of the moment on her shoulders. She had been running for so long, and now she had to keep going. There was no choice. Not yet. They both started walking again, faster this time, but with a new urgency. The night stretched on, dark and empty, filled with only the sound of their footsteps and the distant hum of city lights. The silence between them was different now, more companionable, but still full of tension. As they moved forward, the delivery guy kept his eyes on the road ahead. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: whatever came their way, they would face it together. And that, for now, was all that mattered. But as they rounded the corner and saw a new street ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking toward something much bigger than either of them had imagined. Something that could change everything. The night had grown colder, and the quiet had become suffocating. Every step they took felt heavier, like the world around them was closing in. The delivery guy kept his gaze fixed ahead, trying not to think about the dangers lurking behind them. He didn't want to look back, but he could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him, each passing moment a reminder that they were still being hunted. The woman walked beside him, her steps slower now, her body tense. She had been running for so long, and it was clear that her strength was beginning to fade. But she kept going, one foot in front of the other, as if she had no other choice. And in many ways, she didn't. "We need to find somewhere more secure," the delivery guy murmured, glancing at the darkened streets around them. He had no real plan. He was just trying to think of somewhere, anywhere, where they could stay hidden for long enough to figure out what came next. But as they turned another corner, something caught his eye, a shadow moving quickly across the street. His pulse spiked. The woman noticed too, her hand clutching his arm, her fear palpable. "Is it him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The delivery guy nodded, his heart hammering. He didn't need to look to know who it was. The man was following them, his rage unmistakable, his presence a shadow that loomed over them, growing closer with every step. "I told you, he won't stop," the woman said, her voice thick with regret. "I can't keep running like this. I can't do it anymore." He stopped walking, pulling her gently into a narrow alleyway where they could hide. They were breathing hard now, trying to control the fear that was creeping in. The delivery guy's mind was racing. He couldn't let the woman down, not now. Not when they were so close to something resembling safety. "We're going to face him," the delivery guy said, his voice low, yet resolute. He knew there was no other way. The husband had found them once, and he would find them again if they kept running. It was time to make a stand. "Are you sure?" the woman asked, her voice filled with doubt and fear. "I don't want you to get hurt." He turned to her, his face softening, but there was a fire in his eyes that he couldn't ignore. "I'm not letting him hurt you," he said firmly. "Not again. You don't have to be afraid anymore." She hesitated, her eyes searching his face for any sign of uncertainty. But there was none. The delivery guy had made up his mind. He wasn't backing down. He couldn't. As the footsteps grew louder, the delivery guy looked one last time at the woman, offering her a brief nod. Then, he turned and moved toward the street, his body tense and ready. They had nowhere left to run, but maybe, just maybe, they could stop the cycle right here. The husband came into view a few moments later, his eyes wild with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked around, searching for any sign of his wife. The delivery guy stood tall, positioning himself between the husband and the woman who was now standing behind him. "I told you not to leave," the husband sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can just walk away from me? You belong to me. No one leaves me." The delivery guy stepped forward, his jaw tight, his stance firm. "She's not yours," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "She never was." The husband's face twisted with rage. "You don't get it, do you?" he spat. "She's mine to control. She'll never be free. You can't protect her." "You're wrong," the delivery guy said, his voice steady, even as his heart pounded in his chest. "She's free. She's already taken control of her own life. And there's nothing you can do about it." The husband lunged at him, his hands reaching for the delivery guy's throat, but the delivery guy was ready. He sidestepped quickly, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it behind his back with a force that surprised even him. The man cried out in pain, his body tense, but the delivery guy didn't let go. He had to make this moment count. "Stay away from her," he growled, his grip tightening. "You don't have power over her anymore. Not over anyone." The husband struggled, but the delivery guy's strength held firm. He wasn't going to let him go. Not until the man understood once and for all that his control was broken. The woman stepped forward, her eyes wide with disbelief and a newfound strength. She had seen this side of the delivery guy before, but it was different now. This wasn't just a man who was helping her. This was someone who was willing to fight for her future, someone who believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. "Let him go," she said, her voice stronger than it had been since they first met. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was done running. It's over. For the first time in years, she was ready to take control of her life. The delivery guy looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. Then, with one last twist, he shoved the husband to the ground, watching as the man scrambled to his feet, fury flashing in his eyes. "You're done," the delivery guy said, his voice cold and final. "You're not welcome here anymore." The husband, now on his knees, stared up at him, his face twisted in disbelief. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You'll never escape me. I'll make you regret this." The delivery guy didn't flinch. "Not today," he said. "Not ever." With that, the husband staggered to his feet, his eyes filled with hatred, but the delivery guy knew this was the end. He had made sure the woman was free. He had done what he promised. Without another word, the husband turned and fled into the night, leaving them behind. The woman took a deep breath, her body shaking with relief, but her eyes filled with something new, hope. The delivery guy stood by her side, knowing that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be theirs. Together. As they walked away from the chaos, they both understood one thing: sometimes, the greatest battles aren't fought with fists or weapons. Sometimes, they're fought with the courage to stand up, the courage to walk away, and the courage to choose freedom. And for the first time in a long time, the woman felt like she could breathe. The future, once a terrifying unknown, was now filled with possibilities. The first few days after the confrontation felt like a blur, every moment a mix of relief, disbelief, and exhaustion. But as time passed, the reality of what they had done began to settle in. The woman, once a prisoner to fear and control, was finally free. And the delivery guy, who had never imagined his life would take such a turn, found himself standing beside her as the one constant in this uncertain world. They had driven far from the city, far from the chaos that had been their lives. The car had taken them to a small, quiet town, a place far removed from the pain that had followed them for so long. It was the kind of place where people didn't ask questions, where strangers could blend in without drawing attention. It was a fresh start, one they both needed, even if they didn't know exactly what it would look like yet. The woman had insisted on finding a job. She didn't want to sit idle, to be a burden. She wanted to prove to herself that she could stand on her own 2 feet. But there was a part of her that was still terrified of failing, terrified of trusting again. She didn't know who she was without the fear, without the weight of the past hanging over her. But the delivery guy was there. He didn't ask her to be anything she wasn't ready to be. He was just there, offering quiet support, always ready to help without making her feel weak or dependent. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. One afternoon, as they sat in a small, run-down diner, her sipping coffee, him staring out the window, she turned to him, her eyes searching his face for something she hadn't quite found yet. "Do you think I'll ever be okay?" she asked softly, her voice filled with the uncertainty she had carried for so long. "Do you think I'll ever be able to put everything behind me?" The question hung in the air, heavy and full of weight. The delivery guy set his coffee cup down, turning to face her. His expression was gentle, but his eyes held a kind of wisdom that came only from experience. He had never been through what she had, but he knew what it was like to struggle, to wonder if you'd ever find peace. "You'll be okay," he said, his voice steady. "You might not feel like it right now. But little by little, you'll rebuild. You're not alone anymore. You don't have to carry it all by yourself." She stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words, letting them sink in. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that had been buried for too long, a spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time in a long time, she believed that things could get better. She wasn't sure how, or when, but she could see the possibility. The delivery guy gave her a reassuring smile. "One step at a time," he said. "And when it gets hard, when you want to give up, I'll be right here. We'll get through it together." It wasn't the perfect solution. There were still days when the weight of everything, the trauma, the fear, the memories, threatened to pull her under. There were still nights when the darkness felt like it would swallow her whole. But with each passing day, she found herself standing a little taller, speaking a little louder, believing a little more in the possibility of a future beyond the pain. She didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead would be long. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. A path toward healing, toward a life where she was free to be who she wanted to be, to make her own choices, and to rebuild what had been broken. And she wasn't alone. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, she found a new sense of peace. It wasn't an easy peace. It didn't come without struggle. But it was hers. And with it, came the realization that she had the power to choose how her story ended. The past would always be a part of her, but it didn't have to define her. And as she looked at the delivery guy, standing beside her, offering her a hand when she needed it most, she knew that her journey was only just beginning. There would be more struggles ahead, more obstacles to face, but now, she had someone by her side. Someone who believed in her, who had never given up on her, even when she had given up on herself. In that moment, she understood something profound. She wasn't broken. She was healing. And she was strong, stronger than she had ever realized. The delivery guy looked at her, a quiet smile playing at the corners of his lips. "You did it," he said softly, almost as if to himself. "You're free." And for the first time in years, she truly believed it. They left the diner, hand in hand, walking into the uncertain future. But now, instead of fear, there was something else in the air, hope. The future was no longer a scary unknown. It was a chance. A chance to live, to rebuild, to heal. And as they walked together into that new life, they both understood one thing: freedom wasn't just about escaping the past. It was about embracing the future, and choosing to live in a way that was true to who they were, no matter what it took. Because sometimes, the greatest freedom comes when you choose to take control of your own destiny. And that's exactly what they were doing. Together, the weeks that followed felt like a long, steady climb, a climb from the darkness towards something better. The woman had slowly started to build a life for herself, one small piece at a time. She had found a job at a local cafe, a place that felt safe and welcoming. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. And that was enough. She woke up every morning with a sense of purpose, something she hadn't had in years. It was different now. The weight of the past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer had the power to control her. She was learning to live again, to trust again. And all the while, the delivery guy remained by her side. He didn't try to fix everything. He didn't try to give her all the answers. He simply offered a steady hand when she needed it and a listening ear when the nights felt too long. He was her constant in the midst of uncertainty, and with each passing day, she felt stronger, more confident in the life she was rebuilding. One evening, as they sat together on a park bench watching the sunset, she turned to him, a smile playing on her lips. "You know," she began, her voice quiet, "I never thought I'd get here. I never thought I could leave him. But here I am." He looked at her, his eyes soft with understanding. "You did it," he said, his voice steady. "You found your way out. You've done the hardest part." She nodded, her gaze turning to the horizon. "But I wouldn't have made it without you," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved me. You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself." The delivery guy didn't say anything at first. He simply reached out and took her hand in his grip firm and reassuring. "I didn't save you," he said quietly. "You saved yourself. I was just here to walk with you." She smiled through her tears, the truth of his words sinking in. She had been the one to make the choice, the one to take the first step. And in doing so, she had found the strength she never knew she had. "Thank you," she whispered, her heart full. "Thank you for everything." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the sky. In that moment, it felt as though everything had come full circle. The past, with all its pain and fear, had led her here. And now, she was free. She had made it. But the future wasn't something to be feared anymore. It was something to embrace. She had a chance to create her own story, one that was hers to write. And with the delivery guy by her side, she knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. They sat there for a while longer, the world around them quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. For the first time in a long time, the woman felt at peace. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know what the future would bring. But she knew one thing for sure, she was no longer trapped by the past. She was free. And that, she realized, was all she needed. The delivery guy, too, had changed. He wasn't the same man who had walked into her life that night, just doing his job. He had become a part of her story, and in many ways, she had become a part of his. Together, they had faced the darkness and come out the other side. Together, they had found the strength to start over. And as they stood up from the bench and began walking toward their future, side by side, the woman couldn't help but smile. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was a new beginning. And for the first time in a long time, she was excited to see where it would lead. Because sometimes, the hardest journeys lead to the most beautiful destinations. And with someone who believed in her, someone who was willing to walk with her no matter what, she knew that anything was possible. They didn't have to face the world alone anymore. Together, they had found freedom.